Okay. Hello, everybody. Virginia, would you like to do the intros?
Sure. Yeah, I will get us started. Welcome everyone to AV Geeks at the Hunt Library, not at the Hunt Library currently. I am Virginia Ferris, and this is our 13th semester of this series, partnering NC State University folks with Raleigh's AV Geeks to discuss vintage educational and classroom films. So Skip Elsheimer, the founder of AV Geeks, is an NC State alum himself. He's been for the last few decades collecting films made throughout the last century, mostly 16 millimeter educational training and how-to sorts of movies. He does an amazing job sharing them with the world and currently houses over 36,000 such films at the AV Geeks archive here in Raleigh and shares them as stock footage for films and exhibits, as research material, and during public events like this one. Today's theme is Let's Talk About Work, and we're very excited to welcome our guest, Professor David Zonderman. Dr. Zonderman is professor and department head of history here at NC State, where he teaches great classes about American labor history, public history, and museums, all kinds of great things like that. Dr. Zonderman has written several books about American labor history and has worked with museums across the country. He's currently working on a book project titled Fighting on the Home Front, Workers in the Civil War, and we're delighted to have him join us today. And just a reminder that over 200 of AV Geeks compilations are available for checkout from the libraries. And you can also visit avgeeks.com or search for AV Geeks in YouTube or at archive.org to find those online. So I will hand things back over to you, Skip, to kick us off.
Excellent. As always, I am wrangling with how Zoom is handling us. And Dr. Zonderman, would you like to say hello?
Yeah, it's great to be here, and thanks for having me. I think this is a wonderful presentation, both on the subject matter, because obviously being a labor historian, talking about work is what we do. And as Skip and Virginia and the rest of the crew were talking, it brings back very fond memories for me. I am a child of the 60s and 70s when we watched these films. We also had those film strips with the accompanying recording. I remember there were AV Geeks in my elementary school and high school, and so thanks for having me.
Did you ever run a projector yourself?
A couple times, although if the film ever like fell off the splice or fell off the reel, I was the wrong guy to try to rethread it. I mean, looking at that, I mentioned to people, I'm really bad with schematic drawings, diagrams. So when the instructions to rethread, I would go, forget it. Someone else, please help me.
Nice. Well, in talking with you and when you were recommended as an expert, and you said, well, I do labor history, I was like, wow, I have a lot of films about work, about labor stuff. And specifically, you were interested, you said if you had anything about labor unions. I had a lot of stuff about unions as well, both pro and con. And so what I did is kind of split the difference here. So I pulled two films that are made by the AFL-CIO, and they were made to educate the public about different occupations, and specifically trying to either say to the public, like, here's how useful this occupation is to your society, or, hey, this might be a job that you're interested in. And I believe all these jobs are ones where there were unions behind them. So the first one we're going to watch is awesome. It's one of my favorites. It's called Barbers. And you want to talk about, Dr. Zonderman, you pointed out like that you definitely remember, well, there's some weird, interesting gender stuff in here about barbers versus hair salons. So let's go ahead and watch Barbers. I'm going to switch over here.
Americans at work. performing a service on which every man, woman, and child depends. Barbers and beauticians, important people in the lives of well-groomed and attractive women. For appearance sake, these workers are a necessary part of our lives. For more than 6,000 years, the art of cutting hair has been practiced as a craft. In ancient Egypt, barbers trimmed the square-cut beards of the pharaohs. Today, they care for the square cuts on top of the head. The modern mirrored barbershop of today is quite different from the tonsorial parlor of 50 years ago. But the barber's work remains the same. A never-changing part of his job is reassuring youngsters who, while they may not object violently, are still a bit hesitant about a haircut. Under the striped barber cloth, any customer becomes wrapped in some of the tradition that has surrounded barbers and their shops since the time of Plato, in the days of ancient Greece. The first barbering clubs were formed where men would meet to discuss the topics of the day while having their hair trimmed and beards curled. Today's barber is still an advisor or patient listener to affairs in the lives of his customers. To women, a beauty salon is more than a feminine barber shop. It is a place where they may be transformed from commonplace to outstanding, where natural beauty is developed and accentuated. Often, a woman's attractiveness begins in the hands of a hairstylist, an artist who can instantly create an individualistic coiffure and communicate the exact details to an assistant. Hairdressers learn by doing, following the instructions of the stylist, who may be guided by the season, the shape of the head, or features of the face. An entirely different treatment may be dictated to satisfy the mood of his customer. From courts of royalty, the beautician has become an important part of everyday American life. Just as a beautician learns the craft on the job, a barber begins as an apprentice in an established shop. In times past, a young man learned how and went to work. Now, in all but a few states, he must be schooled and examined before he can be licensed as an apprentice and then as a journeyman barber. Eventually, he may open his own shop where he might begin training licensed apprentices himself. The transformation that can take place in a young girl's appearance simply by changing the style of her hair is deftly accomplished in the hands of an experienced beautician. That little girl look can be replaced by sophistication with quick strokes of scissors and comb. Mother and daughter visits to the beauty shop are becoming as regular as the traditional partnership of father and son at the barber shop. This is an exclusive men's world where women do not go, even though the first women's haircuts were performed there before beauty shops were opened. Many women average 2 hours a week in a beauty salon. The care given their crowning glory depends on how much time they can give it and the skill of the beauty operator. Since 1945, an increasing number of men have chosen the beautification of womankind as a career. Their customers have confidence in their judgment because, after all, who is more appreciative of beautiful women than a man? The way to beauty may not be the most attractive, but the admiring glances that result are worth it. The Union Shop sign is a symbol of good barbering today, just as many shelves of personalized shaving mugs indicated it in the gay 90s. With the passing of the shaving mug and mustache wax went another of barbering's most prized accomplishments, the harmony of the barbershop quartet. A barbershop is a combination of many things, old and new. At one time, a man visited a barber shop as much to relax as to have his hair attended. Now, modern women go to the beauty shop with the same objective. Special facial treatments bring to milady's countenance a look of health and youth. A manicurist shapes and polishes her nails to accentuate the length and gracefulness of long, tapering fingers. Knowledge of skin care and facial structure is something a beautician learns as an apprentice. Her fingers are the tools with which she always works. The direction in which they move, the rhythm of the massage, perform another kind of beauty magic. A woman's hands are as important to her as her face, hair, and clothing, if she is to feel well-dressed and at ease. Men are no more without vanity than women. As members of a civilized society, we are concerned with our appearance before others. In earliest civilizations, the barber has been an integral part. While we are not too sensitive to changing fashion and style, it was not always so. Men once wore wigs and elaborate haircuts that required more hours to prepare than many women spend before their mirrors today. The convenient shortcuts men now wear require less time. But father and barber begin early to train a youngster's hair to the shape it will take as he grows. Because women can wear their hair very long or short, or anywhere in between, they may present an endless variety of styles for their admirers. Of course, once long hair has been cut short, only time can change it back. But in the meantime, a clever stylist can change its shape to emphasize features, to change the entire appearance of a customer. Cutting hair to fit a specific personality is what makes the difference between a hair cutter and an artist. It is amazing how happy a boy can look after a haircut, especially as soon as he steps down from the barber chair. To most of us, when we are young, haircuts seem pretty useless, since the hair will always just grow back again. For some of us, anyway. But when you're on your way to meet your best girl, it's worth all the trouble. Of course, one of the things a man almost always forgets is that it takes longer for one woman to finish in a beauty shop than it takes for two men to get their hair cut by one barber. Waiting for a woman to leave a beauty salon has probably contributed as much humor and frustration to civilization as any other single human endeavor, but there really is a reason for the waiting. Every part of beauty care must be performed slowly and with attention to detail. It is really to the beautician's credit that it takes as little time as it does to cut, wash, set, dry, and comb a woman's hair. The curls, swirls, and waves that constitute a hairdo require skill in the hands of the hairdresser and patience on the part of the customer. When the girls finally appear before their men, all the time spent is forgotten. If attractive people are the leaders of society, then barbers and beauticians are the molders of leaders. To explain all the mystery surrounding a woman's ability to make herself beautiful would be impossible. Not even all the secrets of what goes on in a beauty salon are obvious to an outsider. A beautician trained in all the aspects of beauty culture, from washing to waving, including facials, manicures, and cosmetology, knows more than words can tell. The proper use of hands and equipment, the way to roll a curler, is something not always expressible in words. It is enough that we are able to enjoy the work of the beauty salons wherever we turn. All over America, there are barbers and beauticians whose aim in life is one of service to the appearance of mankind. These are people whose craft dates back to the beginnings of civilized society, whose union stems from the Middle Ages, when barbers and surgeons were one. Today, they are members of the Barbers, Hairdressers, Cosmetologists, and Proprietors Union of the AFL-CIO. Americans at work for you. Americans at Work, presented as a public service by the AFL-CIO. Next week, another interesting story of Americans at work. Americans whose skill and effort help keep our country great and strong.
All right. So, Dr. Zonderman, what do you think?
Oh, a lot of stuff to talk there. I'll just mention a few things, and we welcome, we'll have discussion later on so we can pick up on a whole bunch of these different things if we want. Obviously, there's a lot of talk about both barbers and beauticians as craft workers. They talk about these are crafts where people actually go through formal apprenticeships and journeyman status and then are considered masters. It doesn't always quite work that way now. These films were made 60 years ago. But people need to remember that barbers and beauticians in most states are still licensed. In fact, sort of the anti-licensing movement often makes fun of cosmetology licenses. But in fact, if you go to someone who doesn't know what they're doing with barbering or beautician work, you can end up with at least ugly hair, if not like burns and things. If people, for example, hair dyes and stuff, if you don't know how to deal with them, you can end up burning people's skin. I mean, so this is actually not a joke. It's serious stuff. They also, of course, given that it was made by the AFL-CIO, they reference unions. I didn't look this up, and we probably could at some point, but I believe that union is no longer an independent union. It's been absorbed and into another union, but I'll be darned if I can remember which one. A lot of those smaller craft unions kind of died out in recent decades. They also refer to this work as being artists. And that, again, that's an interesting phrase that we could think about. I'm not sure we want to go down this rabbit hole, but it's interesting. And there are recent Supreme Court cases where cake bakers have said that they are artists and therefore shouldn't be subject to things like anti-discrimination laws if they choose not to make cakes for certain people's weddings. Some people may know that. That's actually a source of deep litigation now. So the whole idea of calling certain workers artists and what makes them an artist, there was some really interesting talk about physical beauty. And in effect, beautiful people are leaders. That sort of jumped out at me like, whoa, I'm not sure we'd quite say that today, 60 years later. That's making that's a sort of leap from point A to point B. But again, these are sort of the assumptions. I mean, I think people still have some of those assumptions today, but we don't necessarily voice them quite the same. And then, you know, that leads to all kinds of questions about gender, both in the work that a barber does versus a beautician, and of course the customers and who goes to these workers. One other obvious thing, of course, is race. These are all white people in this film, although many, I'll make 2 points on that. In fact, I just talked about this the other day in my labor history class. African-American men have been barbers way back to the early 19th century, if not back even into the 18th century. And in many cities by the early 19th century, many barbers were Black men because it began to be considered a kind of servant trade. You know, you serve another person's body in a way, and that was beneath workers. Now, if you go ahead a century to the early 20th century, a number of immigrant men became barbers. A number of Italian men were barbers. I mean, I went to an Italian immigrant barber when I was a kid, and all the way through like the 1980s. But race and these, you know, this film sort of assumes everyone's white. The customers are white, the barbers and beauticians are white. But in fact, the African-American barber shop is a sort, there have been some incredible anthropological and cultural studies. These are still male places very often. All kinds of things are talked about, including politics and everything else at Black barbershops. I mean, anyone who runs for an office in an African-American community, if you don't go to the barbershops and the beauty shops, you're not meeting your voters. So I was struck by that. Finally, and I know we want to show the next film, Skip, it seemed to me, is it true that these were part of like an ongoing series? Was this like a TV series? Do you have any idea?
It seems like that it was, based on what they said. Join us next week. That's definitely a TV show trope.
And I don't know whether this was an independent program or whether it was part of another program where for like every week the AFL-CIO produced something for.
Well, they definitely did. It actually was a company that did it for the AFL-CIO. And this is back when television, this is before infomercials. So TV stations were sometimes hungry for content. So it was easy to send them these things. The federal government would do this, state governments would do this, but also special interest groups would do this. They would put together TV-ready programming that they would pass on to the TV affiliates, and they're like, oh, this is free programming. We don't have to pay for this, and we can still put ads on it and everything. And this copy of this film actually had a PSA on the end of it for, it was FDA thing about health quackery. So I know that this was actually shown on television somewhere. Yeah, so this was part of the, you know, back in the, I think in the 50s, the AFL-CIO was like, we need some public visibility, so we're going to take some of our funds and we're going to put together this series. And so this next film is part of that series. And I gave you a couple of films to kind of look at, and we realized time-wise that we weren't going to be able to watch Government Workers, so I'm sorry. But there was also others in this series that I didn't pull, like there's Stagehands, there's it was basically people who put shoes on horses. So it was like blacksmiths, but they it was a very specific.
They call them farriers.
Yeah, I'm not sure. I can't remember what it was, but so there were there's other things in this series, a lot more things in this series. But we wanted to watch Bookbinders, so this is what we're gonna watch next. This is the next film. So let me swap over. Let's see. Zoop. So Bookbinders is next.
Americans at work in an art that is the preservation of all arts, the making of books. These men are masters of their tools, from the most primitive instruments to the latest equipment of the machine age. With other craftsmen, these are the people who make the pen mightier than the sword. History itself began only when men carved their exploits and visions in stone and clay and traced them in crude ink over parchment and papyrus, striving to live in eternal memory through the written word. As history began with writing, it is continued with printed records. Books were the great treasures of the earliest civilizations. Today, they are the great means of communication between people and nations. Even in the most modern bookbinderies, Americans pursue a craft steeped in the tradition of ancient guilds. Although the books most of us buy are machine-made, all qualified journeyman bookbinders must know how to take apart and put together a book by hand. Books from collections of an earlier day must be restored. And this is a loving art, regarded almost with reverence by its practitioners. The well-worn inheritance must be carefully undone. Remove the broken cover. Unstring the worn-out threads. Take the precious publication back to the beginnings of a book. This is a work of infinite patience, of painstaking attention to detail, of fingered skill that is equal to the occasion. Good books are constantly given rebirth by workers like these. Put the pages back together again. Sew them again for another generation of life. Everything must be redone except for the printing. This must be kept as it was, for the typography may make the book a collector's item. This is a happy marrying of antique values with modern practicality. And these workers know that the wearing out of a book from rereading is a truer estimate of its worth than any review by a critic. Hammer the book into a shape better than when it was new. Make it last longer this time. No matter how easy it looks, there's a knack to this that must be learned, handed down, applied thoughtfully. Carefully hand-rounded, seemingly hopeless specimens can be restored to a usefulness that will outlive their owners. A bath is prepared for marbleizing the pages of the ancient book. Any one of a number of patterns may be created by spattering spots of color, deftly placing them, just so. The design is transferred to the book by dipping its trimmed edges, top, bottom, and side, for exactly the right length of time, in exactly the right manner. It would be impossible to get the same effect by any known printing process. If you think it's easy, try it. But please, not on a cherished first edition. A new cover is applied in the same style as the original, perhaps with certain modern improvements. Boards, the bookbinder calls them, covered with cloth and leather, fabricated for prolonged life. Before being ready for recirculation, this assembly of literary material must be pressed into final shape. Then, the most fascinating part to the uninitiated, lettering the back. With nothing to guide him but his mind's eye and the skill of his fingertips, the artisan lays on the gold leaf. With quick, expert strokes, he stamps the title and other pertinent information. A masterpiece of the modern bookbinder's art, the restored volume is ready for the reader who would make the most of his literary inheritance. Today, large sheets bearing several pages come off the printing presses. Traditionally, these sheets are just about the size of the skin from one sheep, used for printing long before paper was a practical possibility. The uncut sheets go to the folding machines, which fold them to desired sizes called folio, quarto, and octavo, depending on the number of folds. These machines can fold from 4 to 72 pages, as fast as you can turn a page. The folded sheet is called a signature. Almost faster than you can follow the action, nimble fingers gather the signatures in the proper order, and by foot action of the woman operator, feed them to a sewing machine. It is here, almost miraculously, that the various sections of the book are fastened together from back to front. These seamstresses of the printed word can make no mistakes, or the book will be entirely out of kilter. Since the resulting sewn portions of the book form a spongy collection of pages, they are put in a mashing machine to press them more tightly together in uniform thickness. A trimming machine shaves the edges of the pages to give the clean, smooth look and feel that you know in the finished book. This tumble-type trimmer somewhat resembles the cold-cut slicer of your butcher. It is this process that makes it possible to thumb through a book to a wanted page for that elusive fact or quotation that you need so badly at the moment. While the body of the book is in production, the cover is being prepared elsewhere in the plant. First, the boards, as they are called, are cut to size. These will become front and back parts of the covers. As they proceed on their way to becoming covers, the boards may be imprinted with title and artwork. The operators of a stripping machine connect the two boards with a strip of cloth, which will later become the back of the cover. Technically, what most of us call a book cover is referred to by the bookbinder as a case. Without it, the hardbound book would not last long. Several more steps are necessary before the book is ready for its cover. A kind of merry-go-round has been devised by the practitioners of this trade to combine these steps and to supplement their manual ability. This machine does many of the things we saw earlier being done by hand. But while handicraft sets the standard of quality, these workers control expertly the machines needed today for modern mass production. At this stage, the back is rounded into its familiar shape, so you can conveniently turn the pages. It is lined and glued in readiness for the covers. It is here that the men who feed and tend this machine must feel most the truth of the biblical statement, of the making of many books, there is no end. The greatest act in precision of timing and perfection of performance is reserved for the last. Under the supervision of experienced hands, the casing-in machine applies the covers to the books. The watchful eye of the trained craftsman is especially needed at this point. Each book, with its cover, must satisfy inspectors that it will not fall apart in your hand. Now the total job must be given final shape. The complete assembly of pages and cover is put into a press, where it is kept until thoroughly dry. Then the book is ready for you. Not only books, but pamphlets as well are an important part of publishing. These women are gathering the pages in correct order and placing them on a fast-moving saddle for subsequent stitching or gluing. A large publishing house may have as many as 10,000 jobs going through it at any one time. Making the ruled pages of notebooks and ledgers is a fascinating aspect of this trade. The paper ruler here has an arsenal of implements at his disposal. For some forms, he uses discs. For others, he uses pen points to spread the ink that divides the page into countless different patterns. A seemingly endless river of paper may be printed on both sides simultaneously when this craftsman makes an ingenious adjustment of either discs or pens above and below. It is doubtful that the bookkeeping of our industrial world could be carried on without this activity. Did you ever wonder how a spiral notebook was made? No more complicated than this, if you have deft fingers and the right equipment. The wire bindings are attached almost faster than you can watch the action, sent on their way and locked into place at the end of a moving belt. And there you have another indispensable tool of the business world, the stenographer's pad. Modern accountancy is indeed dependent upon these forms and record books with their single, double, and triple lines needed to separate the innumerable items that must be entered in the spaces between. The art of bookmaking is older than printing by many centuries. Yet today's members of the Brotherhood of Bookbinders, artists of the AFL-CIO, are able to supply the demand for the most important ingredient of the modern world, literacy. Following a craft as ancient as cave drawings, these union workers of the book industry are second to none in keeping pace with progress. The ingenuity which has been passed on to the folders, gatherers, sewers, trimmers, liners, and case makers in a proud profession is constantly at work for you to produce our greatest treasure, knowledge. Americans at Work, presented by the AFL-CIO. Next week, another interesting story of Americans at work. Americans whose skill and effort great and strong.
So, let me spotlight you. Dr. Zonderman, what do you think about that?
Many of the same themes, a lot of stuff about craft and sort of the learning of the craft. They talk a lot more about sort of skill and practice and knowledge that goes into craft. I also like the way this film sort of combined, about approximately the first half is on these very skilled book binders, and then it turns to a factory tour type film that looks at the mechanization of the process. And again, as a labor historian, I can tell you that's just like sort of labor history 101. That's one of the biggest stories, particularly in the United States, but also, of course, Europe, and then sort of slightly later in the chronology, Asia as well. The mechanization of what were once a lot of handicraft industries, whether it's weaving, shoemaking, printing, bookbinding. I mean, we go on and on and on. And then, of course, in the 20th century, you get industry, automaking actually began as sort of out of carriage building by hand, but very quickly became a mechanized process, and then the development of the assembly line. So, that story is conveyed in this film a lot. I'll just take one issue with the film. Right at the beginning, they say history begins with the written word. And my colleagues who work in oral history and anyone who studies African history, that was always what sort of Western white folks said. Oh, there's no African history. African people didn't have written languages, blah, 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 blah. Well, that's not entirely true. But in fact, even in various African societies that did not have written records, their oral traditions and cultural traditions and physical artifacts convey enormous historical knowledge. So I just had to sort of, if I were running the film, I would have said, stop, wait a minute, false play. But the rest of it is really interesting. And so, again, I think that one had some similarities to the first one, but then that whole tour of the factory, obviously you don't get your hair cut in a factory situation. So that's one where sort of barbering has remained much more of a individual physical craft, and publishing has become very mechanized. And in fact, the first steam presses were used, if I remember correctly, back in the 1840s and 50s, and kind of revolutionized mass production of newspapers as well as books and pamphlets. So it's really, really important.
So what strikes me about these films, and really the reason that I collect and show them, is to learn how the films still teach us and allows us to do kind of a comparison contrast to how it used to be and what are factors that we're dealing with now. And with with barbers and salons, two things come to mind. One, during the pandemic, there was a period that barbershops were not open, and there was a big push to get them open. And secondly, some salons that are dealing with labor situations related to human trafficking.
Yes, particularly nail salons.
Yes,
are infamous for that. And you're right. There was, the week to this day, how your hair looks, the color it has, the length, the shape, very important to people's sense of identity. So the fact that people going around with uncut hair caused great consternation to a lot of people, and it's serious stuff.
And I had a salon friend who was talking about that because she was a licensed beautician in North Carolina, she wasn't allowed to go to people's houses and cut their hair. And this was a North Carolina thing. And so that comes up as well, is the idea that, well, during a pandemic, maybe you could just have the salon person come to you, but there was a problem with licensing in North Carolina, at least, that you could get in trouble. And so that was interesting to me. Now, the bookbinders thing is interesting to me because almost all those jobs don't exist anymore. And how does, even back then, as you were saying, there was this transition from craftsperson to mass production in assembly line. And then, the footage of the women who are feeding the pages into the binder. I mean, all that line of women, that right. Job doesn't exist. Those jobs do not exist anymore.
And the monotony of it.
Oh yeah. And
also in the second film, there is a substantial presence of African-American workers, which is interesting to note. And I'm guessing maybe that was filmed in New York, but I'm not positive that those jobs would have been available to both African.
It was either New York or Illinois, or it was a big northern enterprise. And I actually looked up because they were saying like a large publishing house employs up to 10,000 people. And I was like, I wonder if that's still the case. and Random House still has 10,000 people as of 2 years ago. The other ones not so much. They're kind of in the lower thousands. But the fact that books are themselves becoming more and more difficult, that there's in parts of the publishing world that are now all electronic. Especially we think about newspapers, the way that news is delivered.
Yes, I mean, and that's the other part that sort of, and my guess is maybe there's another film on printers, because the story in the film picks up after the pages have been printed, so it's only showing you the binding process, which is, I think, fascinating in and of itself. And I thought it was really cool, those machines that make ruled and lined paper, and how they used to have to draw. That's all now done on computer systems, but how they had to draw those little wires by hand to make the designs. But also printing itself was just revolutionized. I was in college in the late 70s, and I was a college newspaper geek, and we used to publish twice. I went to a small college, so we published twice a week, and we take our stuff to a local printer. And it was just when they were going from what's called hot type to cold type. And in fact, they did some of both. So there were still two old timers running the giant linotype machines with the hot lead slugs. And then they had the first of what were called the CompuGraphic, computerized, that would you would type in them in like a typewriter, and it would spit out this lined sort of print copy that you would then paste onto sheets, and then they'd photograph those and make the plates that would actually go in the printing process. So, and that caused, the printers unions at one time were highly skilled and very powerful. They could make or break newspapers. And by the early mid 1980s, they were almost all gone. Huge fights over technology and trying to save jobs, and a number of big newspaper strikes at that period. So I know that's not exactly this film. It's sort of the film before that film that we watched, but it's an important story as well.
So we have a question from Marion, who is one of our library staff. She has a question that goes back to the first film about barbers. Can you talk about the protection of the workers themselves? And she's thinking about the nail salon workers who are exploited, but also exposed to dangerous chemicals.
It's a great point to make. And again, we already mentioned, and it's an enormous problem in a number of cities. I know in New York and LA, and probably in other cities as well, there have been several investigations about a number of young Asian women are brought to this country to work in these nail salons under indentured servitude, really. The stories remind me of the so-called Chinese coolie labor of like the 1860s and 70s. And in fact, the students in my labor history class just recently read a document of a young Chinese woman in the 19th century brought here pretty much as an indentured servant to work as a prostitute. So some of the stories that are coming out even today, as a historian, I feel like I'm looking back 150 years ago, and not in a good way. This is not like nostalgia for the good old times. It's like, oh my goodness, this kind of stuff is still going on. And chemical exposure.
The Chinese, the coolie labor, what were other, besides prostitution, what were some of the other things that...
Well, they worked, a lot of Chinese immigrants worked, the men worked on things like mining and the railroads. They were, much of them were in the West Coast area, although eventually there is this weird story of a shoe factory in the northwest corner of Massachusetts, a little town called North Adams, where the owner brought in Chinese workers as strike breakers, and all hell broke loose. In fact, it became this giant debate in the Massachusetts state legislature about trying to ban, importation of coolie labor and scab labor and things of that sort. So, and the exposure to chemicals, again, is a very real thing. I don't have much expertise on that, but yes, if you're a beautician, more beauticians than barbers, although some barbers certainly deal with hair dye products. But hair dye, as I say, the fumes can be nasty. Sometimes they're caustic. You have to be very careful of where you put it in the hair and on the scalp, and if it, if you don't know what you're doing and it starts running down your face or back, it's not only embarrassing, as I have to be snarky here for a moment, as we saw with Rudy Giuliani, but it's actually can be dangerous if you're dealing with the uncut chemicals. So that's very legitimate concern.
So another aspect to this is back to the bookbinders, and how do unions historically deal with like entire segments of a specific trade that suddenly disappears and is made obsolete because of some sort of innovation? Because certainly that's what we're experiencing now. Is there's a lot of things that people used to do that now suddenly poof, an app has now made that it's obsolete now because you don't need those people anymore because you have this app that does it.
Yeah, no, it's a great. I mean, I mentioned printers. Another very powerful example from the 20th century is railroad workers. There are both fewer trains running now, and the number of men and women you need on a train crew is a fraction of what you used to need. Firemen to, throw the coal into the firebox, and you needed brakemen to go from train car to train car to set the brakes, and that was incredibly dangerous work. And that's all, a typical, even a giant freight train today needs a very small crew. I mean, you need a very skilled engineer. If you don't know what you're doing, you're going to be in a world of hurt trying to run a locomotive engine. But beyond that, a couple other people to run it. So, and for example, the railroad unions, they used to be called the brotherhoods, very skilled and very powerful. So they fought. They did several things. One is they tried to slow down or fight, in some cases, the technological change itself, or they did, the phrase has come down today, it's called feather bedding. They would try to sign contracts to where you really only needed a train crew of 6, but they would insist you had 10. You really need an assistant to the assistant, and, what I try to explain to my students is, yeah, the companies didn't like it, and we can look back and say they were, they really had extra people they didn't need, but they were trying to save people's jobs. So I have a bit of sympathy for that. I'm not going to defend feather bedding like it's the most sensible, efficient thing to do, but I also try to understand when you're talking about real people's jobs, and often skilled jobs that paid pretty well, people are going to fight to keep them. I mean, if it were my job, I'd sure as heck try to fight. Same thing went on with the printers. They as I say, some really big strikes to try to slow down the introduction of new technology, or again, at least say, in some cases they tried to get contracts that said, the guys that are over 50 or 60 get another 5 years, or get early retirement buyouts, or things of that sort. So, and as you were saying, Skip, and I agree with you, this kind of change goes on in dozens of industries. And often usually the correlation is the more skilled the work, the more the resistance, or at least attempts to resist. Often it didn't succeed. If a new wave of machinery replaces less skilled workers, they don't have as much bargaining power because they're not very skilled to begin with. And so if they, for example, go on strike, the company just hires a bunch more people to do their job and phases them out eventually. And of course, that's also a really important thing to think about is, why do things become more and more mechanized? There are arguments for efficiency. There are arguments for saving money. In some cases, there's also, the companies won't admit to this publicly, there are efforts to break unions. If you can displace skilled men and women that are in powerful unions and get them out of the way, you in effect weaken or eventually eliminate the union. That many companies see that as, hey, that's a great benefit. Why would I not want to install this machinery? And
I think that's what's interesting when you look at new technological advances is thinking about what is the labor trail that's left behind. So, for example, autonomous vehicles and the implications of that. A lot of people think, oh, well, I can sleep while my car drives me. But really, it's about truck driving.
Exactly.
And, they came up with a robot that flips burgers. And I'm like, oh, no, that's about the people that work in food industry.
Yep. No, in fact, my colleague in our department, who's our historian of technology, we often talk about that. People often think about technology as just like inevitable. And it's sometimes called technological determinism. Well, it had to happen. Or, Joe Blow invented something. Of course it was going to turn out this way. Well, an invention could have been done a different way. There could have been a competing invention that didn't get money behind it because, in fact, it didn't displace as many workers. So companies looked at it and said, we don't want that one. We want the other one that gets rid of 20 workers, not 10. So there's all kinds of social, economic, political with a small p, decisions that go into technological innovation and choices that I think we as historians need to think about. It's not just as inevitable. Someone so invented something, of course it's going to happen.
And then the concept of the gig economy, I guess, are we returning back to a time where, people were just jack of all trades, like would work multiple jobs or multiple tasks just to pay the bills?
That's a great point. And I think you're right. We need to, in some ways, the gig economy is very new, and in some ways it's very old. And the people working in it, as you say, in some ways, I mean, the specifics of what they're doing were not what we would have done 50 years ago or 100 years ago. But as you say, the sort of, cobbling together a living, absolutely. Again, and I keep referring to the course I'm teaching now is my 19th century labor history class. And soon my students are going to be reading a terrific book. It's called Scraping by Seth Rockman. And it looks at Baltimore in the early 19th century. And you might say, why Baltimore? And it's partly because he grew up there, he knows the city, but what he's done is he's looked at what we would call today probably the urban poor or the underclass. So he's not looking at the craftsmen, he's looking at like day laborers and rented slaves and free Black people at the sort of lower end of the labor market, and how they literally scrape by. And how, as you say, they often are doing almost different jobs every day, just literally making a buck or a half a buck just to, get food on the table for that next day. So yeah, and the parallels are quite strong to today.
So I have one last little story to tell you that's related to unions. I did a screening at the Museum of the Moving Image in Queens, New York.
Yeah.
And that was a union house, meaning that the projectionists were all union members. So, like I said, I start my live shows with a film strip. And so I brought my film strip projector, and I was told that I was not allowed to operate it. So we set it up, and they had some young guy who was obviously not one of he was like a new guy. They had him run a film strip projector, something that a third grader would operate. And I gave him instructions on how to do it. I said, all right, so you turn this little knob, and you can adjust the frame with this, and just listen for when people read the frame, then move on to the next frame. He had the worst trouble with it.
But there again, that's protecting their jobs. Yes. That's their turf. I'll give you another example, in fact, from New York, just real quickly. You had mentioned there's a film on stagehands, which would be really cool to watch, because to this day, a very powerful craft union is called IATSE, IATSE, the International Association of Theater and Stage Employees. And it's not the stage employees like the actors. That's actually the Actors Equity, which is also a very powerful union. But IATSE are the stagehands. And a few years ago, my younger son's high school band, the concert band, got to play Carnegie Hall, which was really pretty cool. I mean, I was so jealous because I happen to love music. But one of the assistant band directors who works with the percussion was on the stage, and he starts moving stuff around, and a guy sort of taps him on the shoulder very nicely, he didn't get mad. Just said, "Sir, you don't touch any of that stuff. First of all the stuff belonged to Carnegie Hall." He's like, "Don't mess with our stuff, because if you drop anything, people are going to get mad." But it was also because that's their job. It's the IATSE crew that is in Carnegie Hall that moves around the timpani and all that stuff. And so I sort of nudged my wife. I said, bet you that guy's IATSE, and he's telling them, don't mess with my stuff. But, you know, I respect that. These are people trying to preserve their jobs. So.
Excellent. Virginia, are you handy?
Yeah, I am here. And wanted to thank you both. Thank you, Professor Zonderman and Skip, for this fascinating conversation. This was wonderful. And just to remind everyone to visit avgeeks.com for more information and check out compilations when the library's physical collections are back open. So our next show is 1 month from today, Friday, March 5th at 3 p.m. once again. And this one will be called Let's Talk About Animals with Nicole Welk-Yerger. She's a postdoctoral teaching scholar in agricultural history at NC State and will be featuring vintage educational films about animals. So tune in then. And in the meantime, you can watch previous AV Geeks events like this one hosted on the library's website. So take a look and have a great weekend, everyone.